Hi, my name is Katie Lemieux. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, graduate of NOVA. I am also the vice president of the Broward Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, a state of Florida approved supervisor for both mental health counselors and marriage and family therapists, and I'm the proud owner of my company called Lemieux Solutions Unlimited. And I just wanted to take a moment and thank Dr. Kate for inviting me to come speak to you guys, and seeing that I usually see clients during the time that you guys are in class, we thought what other better way to have me get to you except through technology. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to answering your questions, and I hope to be of help to you.
Katie, what are your websites?
My websites are www.lemieuxsolutionsunlimited.com. So that's Lemieux, solutions with an S, unlimited.com, and familyandcouplescounseling.com.
Katie, what do you wish you knew about documentation when you first started your practice?
So let me kind of just maybe give you a little bit of background on why Dr. Kate probably asked me to talk to you guys about documentation. I kind of grew up and was born in the community mental health arena, which some of you might go into, or some of you already are during your internship. I ran programs for 9 years in community mental health, so I'm very well aware of the documentation, the laws, the rules, the risk management, contracts, outcomes, all those things that are really important that a lot of times in school we don't really talk about. And that is actually where therapists incur the most liability. I don't think that was stressed enough. Therapists do incur the most liability within their documentation. Now, people think about documentation just being what's in your chart. That's not exactly all that documentation is. Documentation could be something like this, for example. Say you're working with a couple, and the couple has a domestic violence charge, and there's a no contact order. And they say they want couples therapy, and they come in and work with you, and they don't tell you that there's a no contact order. Maybe they say there's court involvement, but then you don't go and do your research and request the order so you can see what's in there. You can be held liable for negligence if you're working with a couple that has a no contact order. So it's really, really important to understand what documentation means. It's not just about what you're writing in your own chart. So that's really, really important, and especially in private practice, because you are usually party of your own, and you don't have a risk management coordinator to talk to, or a supervisor who's been on the job for 15, 20 years. So it's really important that you reach out, you get to know what is important in your documentation, what documentation consists of, and of course come to my medical errors training, because I will definitely go over all of that.
What's the most important advice you have for someone who's starting their practice regarding documentation?
Get to know your documentation, get familiar with it. Again, I can't stress enough that it's great to have an amazing clinical skills, but if your documentation isn't on point, that could jeopardize your license, your job, your future, your career. Documentation is as important as your amazing clinical skills. So be great at both of them. A lot of times we hear in the field like, oh, so-and-so has amazing clinical skills, oh, but their paperwork, it's not that good, but that's okay, we'll let it slide. Or so-and-so always gets everything on time, but their skills aren't as great. You know what? Be great at them both. It'll protect you, it'll protect others. It's really important.
What do you include in your consent forms?
One of the things about consent, I have my consent as the therapy policies agreement and consent. So another important thing to know is when you get into your own practice, it's always going to evolve. Things are going to happen, things are going to show up that you didn't anticipate. Remember in ethics when you always ask the question and the answer was always depends? Right, so things are going to come up as you move forward in your private practice, and you're going to then add them to your policies, procedures, and consent. So some of the things that I put in are, well, number one, what I would suggest is read your ethics and know your ethics. There's a lot of stuff that's stated in our ethics that you can actually take the language right out of and put in your consent. And one of those things is you must inform the client of the risks and benefits of psychotherapy. That's really important. That needs to be in your consent. I talk about what clients can expect from me and from my company. I also talk about what I expect from clients. I expect them to be on time. I don't give reminder calls. I don't let clients know when their appointment is. I believe that they're empowered beings and that they are accountable. So I let them know that I don't expect that. I do expect that, I'm sorry. I also tell them about, where we can meet, where we can have sessions. We talk about my availability for phone calls. or outside session communication. We talk about confidentiality, of course, and the all around aspects of confidentiality. And then I actually kind of added in some of the things that you would imagine nowadays due to technology, or if I run into them in public, or anything about dual relationships. All those things are really important. I talk about if they want a copy of their medical record, how much that will cost them. I also talk about the structure of therapy. So we talk about the intake phase, the assessment, and I call it the enhancement and improvement phase, is when we're really working on what they came there to get. We talk about goals, and we talk about graduation. So I explain the structure of therapy with them as well. I'm sure I put some other things in there. I talk about my cancellation policy. That's really, really important. That helps clients learn about your boundaries, what you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do, and really standing firm to what it is that you value and yourself, and what it is about the expectation that you want the client to come to session with. So cancellation policy is a really interesting beast, I would say, in the fact that it, like I said, talks about you valuing yourself, setting the expectation, and having the client meet that expectation. Because ultimately, and this is what I share with my supervisees, it's not necessarily about charging your client, it's them being there, being ready to do the work that they need to do. So I really go over that in depth with them and kind of share with them what would occur should they cancel. My cancellation policy is less than 24 hours, then a client is held financially liable.
What are the biggest mistakes and errors that therapists make with documentation?
I think that kind of encompasses a lot of the answers I already gave. So not knowing your laws, not knowing the rules, and not knowing the ethics that govern your profession. Those are number one. Number two, like I said in the beginning, is therapists incur the most liability within their documentation. So let me give you an example. So say you had a client come in and they're suicidal, or they express some suicidal ideations. You did a great suicide assessment. They're not suicidal. You gave them a number to reach out in case they feel differently, and you never documented that in your documentation. And say then a client, maybe they discharge and then a month later they committed suicide. They're going to come back and look at your documentation. And if you didn't have that, you did a suicide assessment and why you didn't have them either voluntary or involuntary admitted, you can be held liable. So if you did it in your session, if you talk to someone outside your session in regards to the client, anything that you do with a client or around a client needs to go in your record. So sometimes we get frustrated when, we might be on the road and a client calls and it's a quick call and it doesn't seem like much and we're like, well, I'm not going to document that. Those things are really, really important to document. Don't miss out on those. Some of the other things that are really important is too much documentation. We don't need, it's not a play-by-play. It's not, the NBA finals and we're not knowing who has the ball now and who doesn't, and you don't need to know that. You need to have enough documentation where you do protect the confidentiality of your client, and then having too little documentation in the case when there is a potential crisis or an incident that occurs. You need to really have that detailed out and documented. Those are important things. The other thing too about documentation that people don't think about is how is it stored? How long is it stored for? Again, it's not just about the chart. The other pieces which I had kind of mentioned before are if you are working with other agencies, maybe you're working with ChildNet, or maybe you're working with a probation officer, or maybe you're working with an attorney, it's really important that you take the necessary steps to assure that you have the documentation in your chart that also is going to help guide you. I do a lot of work with ChildNet. So I have a lot of parents court-ordered to receive therapy with me. What I require is that I have the psychological evaluation of the parent if they had one. Why do I require that? Because there's actually recommendations in the back of the evaluation that state Miss So-and-so needs to address issues of self-esteem and address coping skills for depression. That might be an example of a recommendation. What I do is I actually take the language from the recommendation and I put it into the treatment plan that we're working on to show that we are working on those things, we're being collaborative, and we're working for the best interest of the client. Court orders are also very important. Who's involved in therapy, who isn't? A lot of times, especially with ChildNet cases, or maybe you're working with a client who was arrested for a DUI. What is it that the court is expecting? Because the other thing too is you don't want to work on something get the court order at the end of therapy and realize that you guys never addressed that, and now the client then has to maybe have another, I don't know, 12 weeks of therapy because you guys didn't address what was needed in the court order. So those are other important things too. So besides psychological evaluations, there's the court orders, any outside information. Maybe you're working with a child in a school system or a school setting. You know, what are the evaluations of the school setting? Maybe it's an IEP. So taking into consideration that documentation, again, and I know I've said this before, isn't just what you're putting in the chart. So it's all encompassing. Again, I would highly, highly recommend you come to my medical errors training, because that is where you will receive all the information that you need to know. And again, remember, it's always evolving. Things will pop up, our world changes, technology changes, and as we move in advance, so doesn't our ethics, laws, rules, and documentation.
Katie, what do you think are the most important things to include in your progress notes or your case notes?
Definitely date and time. I would say time in and time out. The people that are participating in the session, whether it's the client or the client and the mom, those are important things. Definitely, if you come from a model perspective, what model are you using? Are you specific to those interventions? There's a lot of different ways to do progress notes. You know, you have DAP, you have SOAP. Sometimes it depends on the agency that you work for, what they require, request. Also, the follow-up. You know, when is the next session? Do you assign homework? What is the homework? Also, what is the therapist going to do? Maybe the therapist needs to make recommendations. Maybe something has occurred that's outside of his or her scope of practice. Like, for example, maybe you're working with a client and now they reveal some substance abuse issues, and that's not in your scope of practice. That's another important thing in documentation, is that you're documenting the appropriate needed referrals. So maybe in your progress note you write that therapist will identify 3 substance abuse providers for client and share at next session. So you write that in your own follow-up. And then, of course, in the next session, you want to state that you had given them to the client and who these people are. You would suggest that the client would follow up. Another incidence might be if the client has a medical issue or something that's a psychological issue presenting as a medical issue, that you would recommend that the client be checked out by his or her medical doctor. And then again, you would want to follow up with that, not only in conversation, remember, but also in your documentation. Therapist inquired if Mr. Smith had seen his doctor. Mr. Smith reported that he has an appointment 2 weeks from today. And again, then you would want to follow up in 2 weeks just to see the outcome. So those are some important things to put in your progress note. And of course your signature, your credentials, and your both your printed name and your signed name. One important thing, as you become a registered intern, there is no abbreviation for registered intern. So you need to put registered mental health counseling intern, or registered marriage and family therapy intern, or a registered master's in social work intern. So those are just kind of a few tidbits just to let you know, to get you started on the right foot.